Ric Flair goes in the ring, and it's an overly long promo that Ric Flair just does a bunch of Flair shit like he's done for the last, billion years. And then he decided to throw in the line that he said multiple times in the past. And he said it again in this promo that he invited all the women in the audience, 18 to 28, to his hotel room. They were not allowed to bring their boyfriends or husbands. And apparently he was the only one laughing at this, as the audience was sort of just I don't know, not
Grossed out.
amused. And yeah, grossed out, in particular because Ric Flair in the last few years have been a lot of his sexual harassment issues have come to light in a major way. And oh, we're more enlightened now than we were in 1985. And so the AEW crew knew immediately this was going to be edited out, this part of the promo that he gave. But when Ric Flair came back, he realized it went over like a fart in church. He knew that this didn't go over well. We went to the back, and Tony Khan and them, I guess, had a conversation, and Ric Flair did some passive aggressive shit where, well, if I don't belong, I'll just step away. I'll just go away if I'm causing harm with my promos. Not really understanding how disgusting that part of his promo was, even though he's used it for decades on end, because he did. You can go back and watch. I mean, all these DVDs that WWE wishes they never probably released at this point. I own them. So does Dave. Probably Steve has them, where you can see promos by Ric Flair that is just, sexually demeaning promos all the time. It's part of his character. We're back in the 80s. He was cheered for it. Now you have a new group of wrestling fans that are like, you disgusting old ancient man. What the hell did you say? And here's the thing about Rick. It's really not shtick. It's not Rick shtick. He
It's
means
Rick's
it.
dick.
It's Rick's dick. It's just ridiculous that he is pulling this stuff out of his ass at this age with this demographic watching wrestling. Like, talk about never stepping into the dignified elder statesman that Buddy Rogers became as the original Nature Boy. Jesus Christ. I mean, Ric Flair is a joke. He's a joke. And it's just one of those things where, to be the greatest wrestler of all time, to watch him just not be able to move on past a persona that should have died 30 years ago is just bizarre. But a lot of you guys were talking about it, and it's sort of the talk of the wrestling community. Should he be saying these things today? Should AEW edit them out? What do you think about Ric Flair pissing all over his legacy? I don't know. You need a wrestling topic? Here you go, dozens.
Well, I'll say first, Ric Flair is several years older, or I'm sorry, excuse me, I misspoke. Ric Flair is several years younger than both Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he looks like he could be their grandfather at this moment in time. I was always amazed. This is a side note. I was always amazed for a long time, with as much drinking and as hard living as Ric Flair had done, that he had been as healthy as he seemed to have been for as long as he had been. Which is true until he wasn't, because eventually that will catch up to anybody. And then all of a sudden his health really went south, and he has had all sorts of shit since then. So I still think in some ways he's a modern medical miracle, the fact that his liver has not just completely blown up out of his body at this point. But that's neither here nor there. So I think there's a couple of things to mention here. I think Ric Flair's promos in the 80s would actually still generally be okay today, for the most part, when it was a 30-something-year-old heel character that was doing it. Especially with the, the stuff that Ric Flair was saying in the 80s was not as necessarily inflammatory as the stuff that a heel MJF would say today. But the difference is, there's a massive difference between when a 30-something-year-old heel athlete is saying it to get heat from a crowd, and when a 74-year-old man is saying it without a hint of self-reflection or irony or anything. And I do think that plays into it, especially, as you mentioned, when all of the real life stories about Ric Flair have come out in the last few years. It stops being a show. And that is when, there's the whole thing about whether and it's a different question for everybody, whether or not you can separate the art from the artist, right? Like whether someone can listen to Michael Jackson music without thinking about those scandals, whether you believe them or don't believe them, whatever. Or R. Kelly. I think there's no doubt that that shit was, what a horrible human being. But some people can still listen to his music, and that's fair. Like, it's a different, it's not a moral decision one way or the other. It doesn't speak to anything about you ethically, whether or not you can or cannot enjoy somebody's creative work after being informed of some awful things that they've done in their personal life. The thing with Ric Flair is when his bad behavior so closely mirrors all of the shit that he would say, quote unquote, in character, it then becomes, you can't separate the art from the artist, because it would be like if Michael Jackson, if he was still alive, if he did a song about child molestation, right? Like, in that moment, you would not be able to separate the art from the artist, because they're being blended together in a way that makes that impossible. So I would say that's the issue. And also Flair, for, as much as I am disgusted with him as a human being, I mean, yeah, he's one of, as far as like pro wrestling careers, like one of the best ever. But what he has not done, and as you mentioned, Jason, and I just touched on self-reflection, but like, he has not, and I'm not a huge Chris Jericho fan, but I recognize his talent. It's just something that hasn't spoken directly to me as much, but I can acknowledge, the success he's had in his career, rightfully so. And Sting has done several times when necessary, is as they have gotten older, they have reinvented themselves and in ways that enabled them to remain authentic to an audience. Even when Jericho is playing very clearly these over-the-top caricatures, he did so in a way that the audience could still resonate with. Ric Flair has never stopped being the 35-year-old Ric Flair, and that doesn't work when you're a 75 or 74-year-old man that has been accused credibly of sexual assault. Then, so I think that's the big difference, is that Flair, for all of his talent, never was able to go to a different act. He never was able to adapt as he got older. And that just became sadder and sadder and sadder as the 75-year-old man became still trying to be this 30-year-old person. So on one hand, I'm like, well, I mean, he's playing the character that he's been known to play for decades and decades and decades. But at the same time, like, yeah, it doesn't play the same now as it did back then. And Flair, as who's considered, a great interview and a great like psychologist as a pro wrestler, should be smart enough to know that. But he's never had the self-reflective ability to actually view himself through an honest lens. Which is why he's come across as so incredibly petty and so incredibly sad when kind of discussed in relation to any of his peers that he's had issues with, whether it be a Mick Foley or a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels, and why they all, despite all of their various kind of their own issues in their own lives, have aged so much better in the minds of fans than Ric Flair ever will.
Yeah. Well, it's a sad thing to see somebody that's considered to have the greatest wrestling career of all time and just never find a new form of relevancy as they aged in an industry that admired them. And for somebody that's apparently so good at reading being a psychologist with the audience, he's not reading the room anymore. If you were accused of sexual harassment or sexual assault, which he has been credibly. So, I don't think I would bring up anything like that in a promo again, ever.